I would like to welcome and introduce this morning's speaker, Sister Mary Pellegrino. Mary is a sister of St. Joseph of Baden and has been active in the Federation of the Sisters of St. Joseph throughout her religious life. Her current ministry is a senior vice president with Plant Moran, where Mary assists religious communities in facilitating discussions and work related to animating the mission and charism, enhancing the quality of community life, and making transitions necessary for carrying out the mission in new ways. She helps to ensure that all scenarios and options are developed in the context of mission, charism, and future of religious life, and member engagement throughout the process. Mary served for 10 years on the Baden leadership team and also served in the presidency of LCWR, Leadership Conference of Women Religious. In both of these roles, Sister Mary worked to support, encourage, and promote the ongoing renewal of religious life in the face of unprecedented challenges and changes in the Church, American society, and the global community. I have interacted with Mary over the years through Federation gatherings, vocation ministry, and leadership assemblies. I know Mary to be a woman of faith, filled with hope and joy, living the mission and charism of a sister of St. Joseph. We welcome you, Mary, and look forward to all you have to share with us today.
Hello, sisters, associates, colleagues, co-workers, charism companions all. I'm very happy to be with all of you, although I certainly wish it were in a bit more personal manner. I've been asked to offer some reflections about what it might look like for you or any of us to be tending the flame of our religious life and the life of our charism into the future. In doing that, some of you will hear some common themes from when I was with you at the Federation Leadership Assembly in November, or with others at your Next Generation gathering in January. You'll hear common themes from those conversations because these are the themes of our day. These are the matters of our time, and they all bear repeating over and over again. You'll also hear some common themes and concepts that Carol shared with you yesterday. And I like to think of this kind of repetition in the way that Ignatius directs us to consider repetition in prayer, as a means of sinking deeper and deeper into grace and mystery. Yesterday, Carol offered you images of tinder, kindling, and fuel as you entered into the theme of your assembly, tending the fire. Today, I'd like to offer you the image of air or oxygen, without which fire, flames, or embers can't be sustained. I'd like to suggest that the air or oxygen that's needed to tend this flame of our religious life and charism of unioning love is the imagination that we bring to partner with the work and activity of the Holy Spirit in creating a world that we long to see. So I've titled this time with you as a world we long to see, getting from here to there and our part in it all. I like to think of the oxygen and the air as the imagination that will help us to consider how we'll get from where we are to where we long to be. and to a world that works for everyone. So I'd like to begin with some comments about the future that might help us to think about it and relate to it in fruitful and meaningful ways. And I begin here with an observation by John Shar. John Shar was a political theorist. He was born in a small town, farming town in Pennsylvania. And he went on to be a political theorist, teaching for decades at UCLA. And he made this observation about the future. He suggests that the future is not a result of choices among alternative paths offered by the present, but a place that's created first in the mind and will, created next in activity. The future is not some place we're going to, but one we're creating. The paths are not to be found, but made. And the activity of making them changes both the maker and the destination. The paths are not to be found, but made. And the activity of making them changes the maker and the destination. So one of the things we understand is that what happens in the future is directly connected to what is taking place in the present and what's taking place in the past. And while the future might be unknown, it doesn't come out of nowhere. The impacts of the global pandemic didn't just happen because of COVID-19. The cry and suffering and movement toward global racial justice did not just happen because of the murder of George Floyd. There is a long history of policies, practices, and politics that created the conditions that we see today. And so if we want to see something different in the future, we need to make different choices collectively and communally in the present. And this is the work of a lifetime. It's about generativity. It's about giving ourselves to a future that we might not see, that we likely will not see. It's about giving ourselves to creating a world for which we long and about which we care deeply, but one that we will likely not live in. It's about doing the transformational work for its own sake, because of its own good. And I'd like to suggest that we don't go into this future alone or without companions. We have ancestors and we have companions. We each have our own ancestors who accompany us each day and in every circumstance. And we all together have our charism ancestors, those who are named and unnamed. And then we have more broadly ancestors and companions. And so today there will be 4 of them that I'd like to draw on and whose companionship I welcome. I welcome Esther, Pope Francis, Walter Brueggemann, and John Paul Lederach. So I'd like to first turn to the companionship of Pope Francis. About 4 or 5 years ago, Pope Francis was addressing a group of bishops, I believe in Tuscany, and he made this observation, that we are not living in an era of change, but a change of era. And you heard that yesterday in Carol's sharing with us. And what he means by that is that we are not just living with some changes that are taking place in our society or in our culture, but all of our society and culture is in the midst of a change. And we know that. We sometimes simply don't have language for it. So I'd like to look at some characteristics of what we're experiencing in this change of era. So one of the things that's very, very clear is this decline in institutions. And this is every institution that we can think of, all across civil society, our politics, our discourse, our economics. It includes our institutions of civil society, our church institutions, religious institutions. This is where we as religious institutes locate ourselves in this kind of decline. We're in the midst of a global health crisis that just continues to reveal the fragilities of our systems. And again, the racial justice movement, which continues to reveal and bring to the fore the cries of the human family that have been for so long ignored. An economic collapse like we have never seen before, the widening gap between the wealthy and those without, the widening gap in the distribution of goods. This kind of collapse is not sustainable. And in no way sustainable is the climate collapse that we're experiencing. From the wildfires across Australia and California, to the rising sea levels, to the melting polar ice caps, our common home is being disrupted in ways that we cannot come back from unless we make different choices. A companion that I think that some of you are familiar with is Peter Senge. And he makes this observation, and we know this because he's naming our charism. The key to seeing from the whole is developing the capacity to redirect our awareness toward the generative processes that lie behind what we see. That there are generative processes, that there are life-giving processes that lie beneath what is on the surface. In our work, from the inspiration of our charism that sees all as one, is to be able to recognize those connections. Continue with some wisdom from our companion, Pope Francis. It was just about a year ago that we saw, if you can remember, that image of Pope Francis making his way through a dark, desolate, and rainy St. Peter's Square to deliver an extraordinary Urbi et Orbi address. It was March 27th, 2020. All of Europe was in the throes of the pandemic. The United States had just recently shut down. And nobody knew what the future would bring. And Pope Francis offered this bit of wisdom, calling to us. Seize this time of trial as a time of choosing, a time to choose what matters and what passes away, a time to separate what's necessary from what's not. In that, hear the call to communal discernment, to discern together. And hear the call to start from where we are, to seize this time of trial. Remember Carol's words yesterday, the seizing grip of God. Seize this time in the way that God might seize us. Locate ourselves in the midst of this profound disruption in order to recognize how to best move forward. And we do this together toward a world that we long to see. And so how do we think about getting from here to there? How do we think about this time of trial where we are, these profound disruptions, the declines that we are seeing? How do we think about that contemplatively and be able to look and with our imagination move from here to the world we long to see. And here's where I want to bring in two additional companions. I want to call in Esther and Walter Brueggemann. So if you took the time to read the article, Esther's Gamble, you might recall some of the transformative experiences that were really marked her journey. And so I suggest that Esther's journey is our own journey, and that there are three fundamental shifts that Esther had to learn to navigate, and that we too have to learn to navigate if we are ever going to be about leaving the palace. And I use that term, leaving the palace, as a metaphor for leaving behind a world that does not serve. So let's think about these three shifts. And I suggest the first shift is in the prevailing narrative that we use to describe this world. And it's a shift from the forces of empire to the hospitality of neighborhood. And this is language and images that Walter Brueggemann offers us. It's from the forces of empire to the hospitality of neighborhood. Second shift that Esther learns to navigate, and we too need to learn to navigate, is a shift in our fundamental understanding of relationships, from the primacy of individual efforts and the individual to the primacy of collective and communal efforts. And a third shift that Esther learns to navigate, and is ours to navigate as well, is a shift in our understanding and our relationship with resources. It's a shift from assuming that there is not enough, assumption of scarcity, to an assumption of abundance, where there is more than enough. So let's take a few moments and just look at these three shifts. I'm going to break them down just a little bit more individually here. So what might it look like to begin leaving the palace by shifting a prevailing narrative? So the first one, the prevailing narrative that Walter Brueggemann offers as a way of describing the forces that are operative today, it's the forces of empire. And empire is always about coercive power. It's resources mobilized to serve the powerful. It's creating an ideology of scarcity, creating a narrative that there is not enough. And so everybody has to fend for themselves. The forces of empire tell us that a public life is a monologue, and that reality and information is weaponized and it's politicized. The practice of religion in the empire is conflated with patriotism or nationalism. This ideology of scarcity is primary, and empires, the coinage and economics of empire is greed, fear, and violence. Trading in greed and fear and violence. So think about what we have seen in our culture and what we continue to see in our polarized culture when you think about forces of empire. And the shift, the profound shift that's needed, is to move from the forces of empire as a prevailing narrative to the hospitality of neighborhood. And the hospitality of neighborhood tells us that really life and the way we can conceive of life is through the lens of neighborliness, of relationship. Resources are mobilized to serve the common good, not just a few. Public life is a dialogue. There's a plurality, there's a multiplicity. There's a variety and a diversity of experiences and views, and all are valued. In the neighborhood, we live the gospel. In the neighborhood, there's an ideology of abundance. And the economics of the neighborhood are really built on generosity, trust, peacemaking. So think about these two narratives, and they are each cohesive in their own sense. So if you begin with assumption of scarcity, that's going to take you to the cohesive narrative of empire. If you begin with an assumption of abundance, that takes you to a cohesive narrative of hospitality of neighborhood. So think about this related to what Carol shared yesterday about the decline and emergence that we are in today as a culture. The essence of decline and emergence. The second shift that Esther made and is ours to make is this fundamental shift from the primacy of the individual and individual efforts to the primacy of the collective and communal efforts. And this shift in no way is to minimize the good and the contributions that each one of us makes to a world that we long to see. But it does acknowledge that individual efforts alone are no longer sufficient. What's needed now are collective and communal efforts for us to allow what is declining to decline and to really birth what is emerging. We need collective and communal efforts. Every discipline that you might read right now that considers what would a post-pandemic world look like, every discipline is talking about collaboration, partnership, relationship. It's no longer about one industry, one discipline, one country, one person, one community, one congregation being able to do anything effectively. It is about all of us coming together to create a world we long to see. And a third shift that Esther had to make, and we also have to make, a third shift is a shift from an assumption of scarcity to an assumption of abundance. This sense of, I don't have enough, there isn't enough. There's not enough, we don't have enough numbers, we don't have enough food, we don't have enough sisters, we don't have enough colleagues, we don't have enough associates, we don't have enough money. It's all coming from an assumption of scarcity. What would happen if we began to think about abundance? That we have more than enough. We have more than enough of what is needed to create a better world. It might mean that we redistribute what we have. It certainly means that we do things differently and we make different choices. But that's the shift from scarcity to abundance, from the assumption that there isn't enough to the assumption that there's more than enough. So I'd like to just pause now, kind of take it in, and just pose these two questions before I go on. So how do we begin or continue to engage the shifts that are needed in us, personally and collectively, in order to discern a world we long to see and to get from here to there? How do we think about the future that we long to see, not as some place that we're going to, but as something we're creating as we go? And that's where I want to bring in our last companion for the day, John Paul Lederach, peace builder, conflict mediator, long time professional, immersing himself in the conflicts, generational conflicts of long suffering, and offering his learnings as a way forward to come out of places that feel like impasse and to move forward. And so what he suggests after decades of trying to build peace, negotiate peace accords, and observe the human dynamic in conflict and in peace building. What he observes is that what is needed to move past impasse and to build a better world is really about our imagination. The use of our imagination, and not just any kind of imagination, but moral imagination, is what he suggests is needed to move us into a future that is sustainable, that's possible, and that is good for all. He suggests that moral imagination is the capacity to recognize turning points and possibilities in order to venture down unknown paths and create what does not yet exist. It's recognizing turning points, seeing our impasses as turning points, allowing ourselves to be immersed in the present so that we can see a way forward. So I just want to break open a little bit more what he means by moral imagination. So moral is in and of itself positioned toward the good. It's not just any imagination. It is an imagination that's oriented toward the good. I think we have many, many examples today of imagination that is not oriented toward the good and has taken us into places that are dark and deep and very overwhelming. So our imagination is oriented toward the good. It implies creativity. It implies a creative act. And particularly when the next thing is not yet visible. And that is when our creativity is needed the most. Lederach suggests that what's required for moral imagination is an ethical motivation. What it is motivated toward the good. So it's not about creating a society that is not life-giving. It's not creating death-dealing dynamics. It's not replicating forces of empire. It's orienting our imagination toward the good. It requires a willing suspension of our reason and logic. It will require doing things differently and doing different things and believing that all of those are possible. It requires a belief that what can be really will transcend what is. And it requires contemplative presence. It requires that we be rooted in the present in order to move toward a future. We cannot ignore the present because it's unbearable. It is what we make the future from. And I'd like to close with the 4 capacities that John Paul Lederach's writings can be distilled into as we think about cultivating our own moral imagination, both personally and collectively. So the first capacity, and here's where I want you to really listen for our charism. Notice the contours of our charism here. First capacity that he suggests is that we see the centrality of relationships. That we are able to imagine ourselves living and existing and thriving in a network and web of relationships. To not only envision, but to apprehend, to fully understand the interconnectedness and mutuality of all of the interrelationships in creation. A second capacity is to learn how to practice paradoxical curiosity. It's the ability to embrace complexity, to see beyond what's visible, to discover what holds apparently opposing energies together. This is the capacity that Carol noted yesterday that's needed to bridge our polarities in our culture. This is the capacity to be humble, to take the first step, to be curious about the views of others with whom we profoundly disagree. The third capacity is the ability to provide space for the creative act. It's a commitment to creativity and to the belief that we are able to move beyond what is commonly accepted, to do things differently and do different things. And the fourth capacity is a willingness to risk. This is Esther's gamble. This is her lesson to us. She had no reason to believe that her intervention would be successful. And yet she could not do that for the good of her people and the future. She could not risk. And so it's a commitment to step into the unknown without any guarantee that we will be successful. So all of this is the air that we want to begin to breathe, and that we want to breathe into the fire of religious life and our charism of unioning love. And quite often, because we are connected and because we are part of all of creation, quite often, when we see ourselves reflected in the natural world, something happens to us in a way that teaches us something beyond our reason. So I'd like to leave you today with an image of what is called a murmuration of starlings. And I know it will be familiar to some of you, perhaps all of you, but I would like to leave you with this image as you watch these beautiful parts of creation create a path and a way forward in the same way that John Char suggested that we create our future. A future that is not a result of choices among alternative paths offered by the present, but a place that's created first in the mind and will, created next in activity. This is a future that's not some place we're going to, but one we're creating. The paths are not to be found, but made. And the activity of making them changes both the maker and the destination. So as I leave you with this video and music, I'd just like you to take it in and notice the way that the path is created in the moment, and the path changes in every moment. So thank you for your attention. And this afternoon, rather than hearing me talk anymore about moral imagination, I'd like to offer you an opportunity for some reflection for yourself and in your small group to really continue to unpack what is your experience of yourself in this moment and your capacities, because we all have them, your capacities as individuals and as a community and as a collective for moral imagination, thinking about the future in ways that will create a different future and a world we long to see. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, for your words of wisdom. You fueled our imagination to take with us into our small groups. I'm now going to prepare us for the next two parts of our meeting. First, we will be moving into our small groups to discuss all that Mary has shared with us. I will share my screen with the questions. What resonates with you and why? What challenges you and why? After our small group discussion, we will have lunch tables. As we did yesterday, take a short break and prepare your lunch, and then join your table at 11:45 Central, 12:45 Eastern. There is a link on your agenda to click, which will take you to your group. This is time to enjoy each other's company. At 12:30 Central, 1:30 Eastern, your lunch session will end. You have a half hour to stretch, walk, rest, do whatever is necessary to be ready for our next session. We return for this afternoon's program at 1 p.m. Central, 2 p.m. Eastern. So as we move into our small groups, take a moment to reflect on the two questions on the screen.